At 4:17 in the morning, inside Islamabad's Serena Hotel, the voices finally stopped. A tea tray sat untouched in the hallway. Security men who had been awake all night stared at the carpet like they already knew the cameras outside were about to be lied to. In one wing of the hotel, the American delegation kept disappearing into a private floor to relay messages home. In the other, Abbas Araghchi's team had gone cold, sharp, and openly suspicious. Then came the line that froze the room. "How can we trust you when diplomacy was still underway the last time, and the bombs came anyway?" That should have been the moment the whole thing collapsed. After weeks of war, thousands dead, shipping lanes choked, and oil markets flinching at every headline, this was supposed to be the meeting that decided whether the US and Iran dragged the region into something even larger. Instead, just days later, the temperature dropped. The talk of imminent catastrophe softened. Markets steadied. Officials started using that careful language governments use when they want to sound firm and exhausted at the same time: progress, engagement, continued dialogue. And that's when the real story began, because if you only looked at the public statements, it made no sense. No triumphant treaty, no grand signing ceremony, no clean peace deal, no direct admission from either side that they had blinked. But the war fever broke anyway, almost overnight, which means one thing usually happened in the dark: not peace, not trust, but a deal both sides could survive. And the hidden part is this: it was never about friendship, it was about limits. What emerged from Muscat, Islamabad, and the pressure campaign around both was not a beautiful diplomatic breakthrough. It was an ugly, disciplined understanding. Iran would not get everything it wanted. The United States would not get everything it demanded. But both sides were staring at the same nightmare: a wider war. A longer closure around Hormuz, higher oil shocks, more dead civilians, more domestic pressure, more miscalculation. And when two enemies finally become afraid of the same future, that is usually where the real bargaining starts. If you appreciate stories where power finally collides with consequence, stay with me, because this case did not cool down by accident. On the surface, Washington kept talking like it held all the leverage. Military pressure remained visible. The USS Abraham Lincoln sat in the Arabian Sea as a reminder that diplomacy was operating under the shadow of force. New sanctions hit Iran's energy sector: tankers, trading firms, executives, shadow fleet networks, all of it. Publicly, the message was simple: negotiate now, or the consequences get steeper. But pressure alone doesn't explain why escalation slowed, because Tehran was sending its own signal just as clearly. Iran's position was harsh but precise. It would talk about the nuclear file. It would not casually surrender its right to enrichment. It would not pretend that sanctions relief, frozen assets, and guarantees against future strikes were side issues. And above all, it was telling mediators one thing over and over: mistrust was not a detail. Mistrust was the case. That matters, because wars like this do not end when one side gives a speech. They end when each side believes the other has accepted a boundary. And buried inside the reporting was the first real clue. US and Iranian negotiators were no longer aiming immediately for some sweeping historic settlement. They had quietly scaled back to something smaller, colder, and much more realistic. A temporary memorandum to prevent the return to open conflict, not a peace, not reconciliation, a memo, an off-ramp. That changes everything. Because once you understand that, the overnight end stops looking mysterious. It starts looking engineered. The hidden deal was not a secret signature hidden in a vault. It was a tacit exchange of restraints. Iran needed breathing room. Its economy was already buckling under sanctions and war damage. Protests at home had already exposed how fragile internal control could become under sustained pressure. Tehran also knew that throttling the Strait of Hormuz for too long would hurt its enemies, yes, but it would also turn every Gulf capital and every global energy consumer into an active stakeholder against it. Washington needed an exit, too. A prolonged regional war is easy to threaten and much harder to own. The strikes were controversial. The political costs were rising. Inflation fears were real. And no matter how loudly officials repeated red lines, there was still the oldest problem in American foreign policy. Once you start something in the Middle East, ending it is usually harder than starting it. So the unwritten bargain began to come into focus. Iran would signal that shipping could move more freely, at least through safer channels on the Omani side of Hormuz, if a durable arrangement took shape. The U.S. would leave space for talks to continue instead of forcing an immediate all-or-nothing surrender. Tehran would entertain limits, pauses, maybe even partial movement on highly enriched uranium. Washington would stop pretending that regime collapse was a practical short-term outcome and focus on containment, inspection, timing, and access, not peace, containment with manners. Then investigators and diplomats found the detail that changed the whole case. The fight was no longer only about whether Iran had advanced its nuclear program too far. It was about the stockpile itself, how much survived, where it was stored, and whether part of it could be removed to a third country. That is the kind of technical argument that sounds boring right up until you realize it is where war and diplomacy actually meet. Because once the conversation shifts from slogans to kilos, tunnels, inspection regimes, and timelines, you're no longer in the theater stage of a crisis. You're in the machinery, and the machinery told a brutal truth. The Americans wanted a long halt, even talk of 20 years. Iran wanted something closer to 3 to 5. Washington wanted the enriched uranium gone. Tehran signaled that all of it leaving the country was a non-starter, but part of it? Maybe. Enough to reduce immediate panic, not enough to look humiliated at home. That's not ideology. That's bargaining under pressure. Right there, the center of gravity shifted. Because the hidden deal was not built on trust, it was built on each side giving the other just enough to stop the next strike. Think about how narrow that is. After 6 weeks of war, after direct military threats, after a region already destabilized by Gaza, Lebanon, Houthi attacks, and the long shadow of 2018's broken nuclear pact, the entire system may have turned on something as unsentimental as this: partial access, partial relief, partial restraint, partial verification. The sort of arrangement politicians avoid naming because voters hate ambiguity, but intelligence services and foreign ministries live on it. If cases like this make you think, let me know in the comments, because this is where the myth of sudden peace falls apart. Nothing ended overnight. What ended overnight was the illusion that either side could escalate forever without paying for it. And once that illusion died, the consequences started landing fast. The rhetoric got cleaner. The objectives got narrower. Mediators kept carrying messages even after tense meetings ended without a breakthrough. Pakistani officials, Omani officials, back-channel operators, security staff, all the invisible people who never appear in the final photo kept the line alive. Publicly, both sides preserved their pride. Privately, both adjusted their expectations downward, which in diplomacy is often the first honest thing anyone does. That is why the final third of this story feels so strange to people watching from the outside. No one was dragged into a courtroom, no handcuffs, no surrender ceremony, no dramatic confession. But there was still a defeat here. The defeat was strategic arrogance. Washington learned again that maximum pressure does not produce maximum control. Tehran learned again that calibrated brinkmanship can bring the world to the edge, but it cannot build a future from the edge. Both governments spent years feeding their own domestic audiences myths of strength. Then reality arrived with spreadsheets, tanker routes, satellite imagery, uranium inventories, insurance costs, military fatigue, and the blunt arithmetic of how many fronts a country can sustain before power turns into self-harm. That is the broader lesson no one likes to say out loud. The hidden deal was not hidden because it was scandalous. It was hidden because it was humiliating. It exposed that after all the speeches, both sides still had to crawl back to the oldest language in statecraft: delay the disaster, narrow the objective, save face, buy time. And sometimes buying time is the whole victory. So yes, the war seemed to end overnight, but not because one side won cleanly, not because the truth suddenly triumphed in public. It ended because men who had spent weeks threatening each other finally sat in guarded rooms and recognized the same fact at the same time. The next step was worse than the last one. That is not a glorious ending. It is a hard one. The kind history produces more often than people admit. In the end, there was no shining moment, just fluorescent hotel light before dawn, exhausted delegates stepping out of separate rooms, phones buzzing with leaders waiting for leverage, and a region holding its breath while two enemies backed away from a cliff without ever admitting they had been afraid of the fall. And maybe that is the final truth here. The most dangerous conflicts do not always stop with a handshake. Sometimes they stop with a silence in a hotel corridor, a silence in a shipping lane, a silence after weeks of threats when both sides suddenly understand that survival is the only sentence left worth negotiating. If you believe no one, not even states armed with pride and missiles, is above accountability, remember this one. Because what ended that night was not just a battle rhythm, it was a fantasy. The fantasy that power can keep escalating without eventually meeting its own limit.